And so, with the end of the Spanish-American War and the Treaty of Paris, the United States emerges as an imperial power, becoming one of the leading powers on the globe. Americans had to wrestle with this on a number of levels, and this was truly the greatest point of debate and discussion in the country during this period. You might imagine that American opinion was very much divided, how we felt about obtaining colonies and obtaining these foreign people who are now going to be part of the country. And so we see two different views forming around this. One group that was formed during this time was called the Anti-Imperialist League, and millions of Americans argued against the idea of imperialism. And they argued against it for lots of different reasons, in many cases coming from completely different parts of the political spectrum or American life. One argument to be made against imperialism was, again, hinged on the racist views of the day, that these people are strange and different. If we look at the Filipinos, people from Puerto Rico, even Hawaii and elsewhere, they look different. They speak different languages. Their customs are different. Their religion is different. Their view of the world is different. And we don't want these people. How are we supposed to take them into our country and accept them? We don't want them. And again, this was very much in line with what many people believed already with immigrants who were coming from Eastern Europe and Russia and Italy and elsewhere. Samuel Gompers and others argued against imperialism because it was going to lead to cheap labor, particularly if we look at the Philippines. People would come from the Philippines and work for pennies on the dollar, and Gompers and others thought that this undermined American workers and American labor. Other people simply argued that imperialism was un-American. It violates some of the views at the very core of what this country is all about, one of which being self-determination. People like Mark Twain, the famous writer of that era, who commented eloquently on all kinds of issues, but he had great problems with imperialism. In some ways, it is simply hypocritical. The United States was born by overthrowing a colonial power when we overthrew the British during the Revolutionary War. And now, 100 years or so later, we are doing the same things to other countries. And so many people just couldn't stomach the hypocrisy of this. And yet, as we know, it is the imperialist forces that prevail. We do, in fact, take and hold these colonies. And so there are arguments in support of imperialism. One of them views the taking of these colonies as a bridge or a series of stepping stones leading us to Asia. And again, the open door, the market in China, was still a very important part of our diplomacy during that time. And so there were those who argued, well, all of these little islands along the way are leading us over to Asia and that great untapped market. We continue to see the prominence of the idea of the white man's burden. This is taking the same argument I mentioned above, racism, and just twisting it in a different way. Yes, these are strange and different people. Yes, they are heathens and they are in need of uplift. So let us help them. Let us improve and civilize them. And finally, there is the military argument, and Alfred Thayer Mahan and others very prominently made these kinds of arguments, that these islands will serve as naval stations along the way, and again, marking the improvement and the strength of the American Navy. In fact, the United States would come to learn, and in very difficult fashion, that maintaining such colonies was not going to be easy. This is most clearly evident in the Philippines, where controlling that region turned almost immediately into an uprising by the Filipinos against the United States. This is known as the Filipino Insurrection. Just to note a little bit of the background in the Philippines, their history was quite similar to that of Cuba. They had long been a Spanish colony and then had in fact been engaged in a war against Spain for their independence. That war against Spain was led by a man named Emilio Aguinaldo, who you see in the picture here. Then the United States intervenes, wages their war against Spain, in fact defeats Spain, but now the United States attempts to take control where Spain had been in control. And so Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been leading his forces against Spain, simply turned his efforts against the United States. They didn't want to be controlled by anybody, whether it be Spain or the United States or anybody else. This insurrection, fighting this war against Aguinaldo in the Philippines, ultimately came to be far more costly and lengthy and draining for the United States than the Spanish-American War itself. This was no splendid little war. It dragged on for years and years until finally, in 1914, the United States was able to put down this insurrection, essentially dividing and conquering among the Filipino forces and eventually capturing Aguinaldo. But along the way, more than 200,000 Filipino soldiers and civilians were killed. About 125,000 American soldiers were involved in the war, and it was an incredibly costly undertaking, dragging on for years. It also brought to a whole new level the brutality of war, and some people refer to this as something of a precursor to the war in Vietnam. Not that it leads directly to Vietnam in any way, but just that the conditions, the methods, the challenges were very similar in a lot of ways. This war was characterized by guerrilla warfare, the enemy forces doing some of the same things they did in Vietnam, digging pits and using, poison spikes and sticks and things that one might not think would be effective against a much more heavily and better armed enemy in us, the United States Army. But in fact, those kind of things can be very effective in dragging out the war. By the end of the war, the United States was forced to resort to some of the same methods that they had objected to the Spanish using in Cuba: reconcentration camps, torture, brutality, and all of these sorts of things. The Philippines is only the most dramatic example of the difficulties in maintaining colonies and being an imperial power, outright rebellion and warfare. But it was difficult as well in places like Cuba. As I mentioned to you, while we did not control Cuba directly, we intervened in Cuba many, many times. This is going to contribute to a long, deep-seated kind of resentment. And you all know about the difficulties the United States has had with Cuba recently and during the Cold War. Cuba turning away from the United States and adopting communism. And that's just one example. Maybe there were other options that the United States might have employed. And similarly, the situation in Puerto Rico is a difficult issue. Even now, Puerto Rico's status is a topic of ongoing discussion, especially on the island itself. Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of the United States. Its citizens enjoy certain privileges, particularly if they move to the United States. But there are many Puerto Ricans even today who argue that they should have independence and they should move away from the United States. So whatever the relationship ended up being, imperialism was a very difficult thing to maintain and led to a lot of difficulties that American leadership had not anticipated. One of the great sources that historians refer to and study during this period are the political cartoons coming out of this era. I mentioned to you the yellow journalism, the rising prominence of newspapers, and this was one of the ways that the papers competed with each other for American readers and sales of their newspapers. And so I'm going to show you a few of these just to give you a sense of the kind of images that were commonly used and the tone in these cartoons and the ways that historians might look at it and study these cartoons. As a side note, I think students sometimes find political cartoons intimidating, a little frightening, hopelessly confusing, trying to read layers and layers of meaning into cartoons. And while sometimes, there are more than one way to interpret the cartoons, most of the time it's a simple matter of understanding who the characters are that are being represented. And then you can, the ironies that are being pointed out are self-evident. And so we'll look at a number of these as we go, but this first one from the New York Herald, Monday, February 28th, 1898, if you consider the timetable here, where are we along the calendar? Well, the Delome letter has already happened. The destruction of the USS Maine has already happened, but we have not yet declared war. And so this is in that period when the newspapers were kind of playing on American views that we needed to do something, that we need to intervene. And so you see this cartoon titled "Don't Bother the Pilot." Well, the pilot, if you can read the label on his little hat there, is the President, William McKinley. And it's difficult to say whether he is asleep, although I think that's the tone of this cartoon, playing on the cliche of being asleep at the wheel. And you have the dove of peace kind of floating by. Maybe he's, entranced by this idea of peace. The idea, of course, being that McKinley is inactive. He's not doing anything when most Americans argue that he needs to be doing something. And here's another example from the same time period. This is a beautiful cartoon, Spanish Misrule. And if you can read the caption, it says, "The duty of the hour to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate." And her, of course, we're referring to Cuba. So some of the things that we might note about this cartoon is that it depicts Cuba as a woman. Frequently, these kind of foreign nations were depicted in the cartoons as women or as children. We'll see some examples of that as we go as well. In either case, the suggestion is that they need to be taken care of. The view in that era was that women were not independent and capable of taking care of themselves. Now, children need taken care of perhaps in a different way. They need disciplining, and they're unruly and they misbehave. Women are sort of defenseless and helpless, perhaps well-intentioned, but they can't handle things themselves. And so Cuba, we care about Cuba, but we need to take care of her. Now, if we look at the actual cartoon itself, to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate. Well, what's the worse fate here? We're playing on the old cliche of out of the frying pan into the fire, out of one bad situation into a worse one. So out of the frying pan of Spanish misrule into the fire of anarchy. But this is our view of what would be Cuban independence, right? If the Cubans were to overthrow the Spanish, they would be left on their own, which in the views of this artist is even worse. It would be anarchy. You see Cuba just sort of going up in flames. So again, this reflects the racism or the views of the day, that nations like this and people like this were incapable of governing themselves. They needed guidance. They needed to be controlled. And that ultimately leads to the Platt Amendment. And here is another cartoon, this one again requiring really no interpretation, so you don't need to be intimidated by cartoons like this. It's plain and evident what the cartoonist is suggesting here. This is a very famous cartoon called The Spanish Brute. Adds mutilation to murder. The main soldiers murdered by Spain. So, in essence, what has just happened is the destruction of the USS Maine. This conveys that feeling that everybody shared at the time, that it was the Spanish that had indeed done this horrific act. And you see the way that Spain is depicted, again, virtually inhuman here. The Spanish brute depicted as this kind of vicious gorilla-like creature. Here's another cartoon. There are a number of different things going on here that we need to mention, but this is in that period now of debating imperialism. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? The title of the cartoon is called The Imperialism Stunt. I would argue that this cartoonist has concerns, has reservations about the United States becoming an imperial power, although not everything in this cartoon is negative. But when we refer to something as a stunt, that usually suggests that it is sort of reckless, it's not very well thought out, it's kind of dangerous. And you see that with Lady Liberty kind of balancing across these very perilous waters between the United States and Manila. That's the Philippines. Some of the other things that we see in this picture, of course, you see Uncle Sam sitting there, you see the eagle. These things are presented in a pretty positive light. And the figure on the right, who kind of towers over everything else, is Teddy Roosevelt. And you note that he also is depicted in a very flattering light. He's standing at attention. There's nothing, negative there. On the other hand, we see the two small figures there towards the bottom. I'm not sure whether you can make out the labels on these figures, but the one on the left is McKinley. This is the President of the United States, who is drawn as a little person, childlike, and also wearing a dress. So this is clearly not a very flattering depiction of the President. And by the way, many of the cartoons of this era show McKinley in a similar light. A lot of people were very hard on McKinley at this time. He was thought to be sort of a weak president. We saw the previous cartoon about him not acting, and you contrast that with Teddy Roosevelt, who kind of towers majestically over the whole scene. The other figure next to McKinley, also drawn as a little person, was Mark Hanna, who was a big businessman at that time, wealthy businessman, and it was thought that he more or less controlled McKinley, that McKinley was subject to his influence. And you see Mark Hanna depicted in many of the cartoons of this era as well. Here's another famous cartoon of the day, and you also see some of the same themes or tropes depicted here. It's very well drawn. I mean, this would have kind of captured your attention if you were viewing it. And again, this is the aftermath of the imperial age. Some of the things that you note here is that a number of the colonies are depicted as children, right? And Uncle Sam is the school teacher. He's trying to maintain discipline. He's whacking a few of the children with his stick there. In the corner is Aguinaldo, wearing the dunce cap. So he is kind of the ultimate unruly child that needs to be disciplined. And obviously this is in the age of the Filipino Insurrection. On the lower left, we see the man reading the book there is actually Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great champion of imperialism. Maybe he's trying to impart some of his wisdom onto this whole scene. And then in the background are two women or girls who are very dutiful in going about their business. They represent Hawaii and Puerto Rico as it was depicted at that time. Again, you notice that they are shown as women or girls. They're not unruly like the boys. They don't need the discipline like the children over there, but they still need our guidance and our protection at that time. So they're thought to be sort of the well-behaved colonies, but they still need us to oversee them. And this is another example of the kind of torn views over imperialism. And again, you see some of the same characters and the same ideas we've shown in some of the other cartoons. A game that loses much to win little. So if we think about what are we talking about here? Well, Aguinaldo is over there in the distance, and Uncle Sam throwing soldiers in the direction of Aguinaldo. I get the sense from this, obviously we're referring to the Filipino Insurrection. This cartoonist seems to feel like we're just throwing soldiers away. A game that loses much to win little. And I think in the grander scheme, the game is imperialism on the whole. Maybe the Filipino Insurrection specifically, but imperialism in general costs us a great deal. We're losing soldiers. We're losing American lives. And what are we winning out of this? What are we getting? Also, just notice in this cartoon, again, we see McKinley as a little person wearing a dress, Mark Hanna at his side. And here's a final cartoon, one of my favorites. It kind of sums up our views of the whole imperialist undertaking at this time. You see June 16th, 1898, so we are in the midst of the Spanish-American War at that point. And the caption says, "Hurrah for imperialism." Uncle Sam charging over the edge of a cliff, blindfolded but heavily armed. This sort of defined our view of that era, and in some ways perhaps defines our view from that point to today, bumbling in some ways along, blindfolded, but we've got a lot of weapons. We're very powerful as we do it.